And welcome, everybody, to episode 231 of Live at the Hive, Digital Marketing from the Trenches. Today, we've got a fantastic guest, Roger Nairn from Jar Audio. Roger is a podcast wizard with deep experience in the field. Roger, thanks so much for being here today, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on why businesses need podcasts. And maybe we can just open it up. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your superhero origin story, and how you got to where you are today.
Well, first off, thanks for having me, Dan. And I have to say, I love that intro, and I want that intro applied to me entering any room at any point. I think that would be amazing. So yeah, my origin story. I spent 20 plus years in the advertising world. Absolutely loved it. I was in a client service leadership position for most of those years. Worked with some of the world's biggest brands. Got an opportunity to work with some of the world's biggest agencies. I love the idea of creating advertising materials for clients to reach audiences and engage with them. Mm-hmm. I started getting into the podcast space, though, just as a hobby. I started out with my own podcast. It was my excuse to reach out and have conversations with fascinating people. I made a list of my dream guests. I used it as an opportunity to reach out to them. I was lucky enough to get to speak to some incredible people, including like Seth Godin and Stefan Segmeister and just incredible leaders. But then I started getting the business itch. I started thinking what a business could look like for me that could combine my love of podcasts with my love of advertising marketing. I was lucky enough to meet some incredible people who had their own specialties. My partner, Jen, comes from the journalism space. My other partner at the time, Aaron, had come from the broadcast world and was heavily into the technical side of podcasts, and went out for beer one night, had a conversation about the podcast space and what's being underserved in it. And it was the work being done by brands just wasn't good enough. And so we thought, let's try starting a little agency that can specialize in helping brands get into the podcast space and having them be successful at it. And that was about 5 years ago. Off the side of our desks, we went full time about 2 years ago, and we're now one of the largest podcast production agencies in the world.
Wow. That's a great origin story. And we're going to get into the nuances of podcasting, et cetera, but it seems to be a common thread at this point. It seems obvious now. We were just talking briefly about Joe Rogan, not to kind of focus there, but 10 years ago, it was a bunch of guys on a couch with no lights on, doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah.
It seems, and YouTubers are very much the same way. It seems like over the last half decade or so, this stuff has just exploded and created businesses and created influencers. It sounds like you were on a bit of that trajectory as well with Jam.
Yeah, with Jar, I mean, the podcast has sort of a technology. The idea of like an RSS feed is about 15 years old. But I would argue that over the past 15 years, the actual like content itself, sure, it's gotten better and it's evolved, but the actual like crux of it is really engaging either stories or conversations, topics that are of interest to the listener. Podcast listeners love to learn. They love to get really deep into topics, and a podcast is such an intimate medium, first of all. I mean, right now we're talking to each other in our headphones, and it's literally like whispering a secret into your ear. And as a podcast listener, you develop that relationship with the show, you develop a relationship with the host, and as long as they're bringing the value, either daily, weekly, biweekly, monthly, a show can be successful.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd kind of like to start out with where you saw, like you said, you saw businesses and brands maybe making an attempt at this, but not really being successful. In your early days and when you identified that, what were some of the key points you kind of made to those brands, and how did you win hearts and minds?
Well, so it was a bit of a blend of, hey guys, this is what the trajectory of this industry is looking like. If you're not here early on, you're going to miss you're going to miss your opportunity. But then also we broke down the the value that a listener gets in listening to a podcast. And we took video as an example. We took things like other pieces of content like blog posts and emails, and we kind of like helped them understand sort of where the podcast fits within all of that ecosystem. And actually, there was some great data that was brought out, many years ago from the BBC, which was really helpful, that showed just how much engagement listeners have in an episode or in a podcast, how it's a medium that allows you to enjoy while multitasking. And then sort of like what the long-term trajectory looked like. And so we would have a conversation. We would then really, frankly, just focus right in on kind of what sort of an audience would they want to attract or already exists. What does that audience need? And then how can you as a brand deliver on that need? Does that audience need a good laugh or a good cry? Do they need to be taught something? Do they need help understanding, or do they need a really good analysis on a topic or issue? We're big believers that podcasts allow brands to have really engaging conversations with their audience. It's a two-way street. You get great feedback from podcast audiences, and then you deliver it in the form of more value. But also, we're firm believers that, let's be honest, the world is not in the greatest of shape right now. There's a lot going on. I think a lot of it comes down to like the bare necessities. I think there's a lot of just fear out there. And I truly believe that fear is a byproduct of not understanding one another. And I think the more kind of real, engaged, in-depth conversations we can have, the less fear there is. And I see no reason why a brand can't be what delivers that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you touched on a couple of really important points, and coming from the world of digital marketing, at this point, everything is, say, a Google ad or a 3-second pre-roll, or a 30-second video, 60-second. You don't have, just in the distracted world that we live in. Quite often, marketers and communicators talk a lot about, hey, you've got to be on social, bam, bam, get your TikToks out, your YouTube shorts.
Yeah.
But I think what you hit the nail on the head is that the podcast is the validation of long form, thoughtful input that is really what you need, regardless, I think, of what you're selling, right?
Yeah. And also, you mentioned Google ads, you mentioned pre-roll, let's think about like Facebook and LinkedIn. Like those are all, there's nothing wrong with that. Those are all, viable mediums to market your products or service in. But keep in mind that you're renting somebody else's audience in that case. You're telling Facebook, I'm going to give you X amount of dollars to tap into your audience. But at the end of the day, you don't own that audience from a company standpoint. When you create your own content, whether that's YouTube, whether that's a podcast or through YouTube, that audience that you're building is yours. It's you've nurtured it. They're there for your content. Podcasts are what I would call a pull medium. You're subscribing to the show and you're asking for future episodes when they're released. Whereas, some of the things like programmatic advertising is what I would consider to be a push medium, which is like, I fall within the demographics of who you're looking to hit. And so I'm all of a sudden seeing your ad. Yep. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just different. And so, so a podcast gives you an opportunity to really own, nurture, and grow an audience. And that audience, the data shows, is incredibly loyal to you. They're much more inclined to purchase any product that you perhaps have available. Now, keep in mind the podcast cannot be an ad. Nobody's going to listen to a 30-minute ad. It has to very much be about delivering a ton of good audio content that just happens to be brought to you by a brand. They're much more loyal to you. Yes, so much more loyal to you as a brand. They're much more likely to purchase from you. They're much more likely to share the show and talk about you as a brand, because again, you've developed this relationship. There's a value exchange going on. So there's a ton of positive proof that podcasts are a great place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on a couple of points that kind of don't trigger me, but resonate. One, it's, being on this side of marketing and being a huge believer in social media from way back in the day. this notion of community building. Oftentimes in business, there are certain elements in business, typically sales, that'll be like, that's so soft. It's so fluffy, right? You know, like we gotta eat what we kill. We gotta go get the sales. But I think one of the things also in terms of podcasting is a really great example of what although it sounds soft, like, hey, build a community and build some, loyalty. It's in fact one of the most powerful mediums in order to do that, because as humans, and I always like to dial it back to like human psychology, is we thrive on storytelling, right?
Yeah,
That's why,
sure.
People like the Avengers or, DC Comics or Harry Potter.
The hero's journey. The hero's journey.
Exactly, yeah. And so the power in the podcast is in that long-term loyalty building and customer building. When a business comes to you, and we've had to try to work with this as well, is to prevent that, because I think the notion within business is like, okay, now we can sell. How do you move them over from that into tell the story, build it over time? Is it a process, or do you kind of give them tough love, or what's your process for that? Because obviously you've been very successful.
It's a bit of process, but a lot of it's tough love. I always just put it right back at them and ask them, like, would you listen to a 30-minute ad? Would you spend your time putting on your headphones, sitting down, driving in the car, and turn on a 30-minute ad? And luckily, most of the time they say no. And we also share with them, like, there are going to be brand touch points within the show. Maybe we put the logo in the artwork, but maybe we don't, because I will argue that sometimes that can be a barrier for somebody listening to the show. Of course, we're going to reference the show in the show description. There's going to be a landing page, which is probably going to live within the ecosystem of your website anyways, and it's going to be connected to the show. Within the show itself, it will probably be XYZ show brought to you by XYZ brand. Halfway through, we always do a bit of like what we would call a midpoint rebrand. You're listening to XYZ show and brought to you by this brand. So, I mean, you literally would have no way of listening to the show without knowing that it's coming from this brand. And so, showing them kind of where they're going to get their brand jollies from, is really helpful. But at the end of the day, it has to be treated like another form of content marketing, and it has to be, thought of within the realm of their other marketing materials. And then there's like the tech, there's some really interesting tech things we can apply to, for example, prove to them that the show is converting. Like if you're a B2C brand, for example, you've got a huge online engine where, you need people to eventually make a purchase, buy a pair of shoes or a dress or whatever. We can show them the data of who's listening to the show and then eventually ends up on the website and makes that purchase, or who's on the show and ends up on the website and downloads a form or a white paper or whatever whatever that conversion is. So, we are big believers in making sure that the show isn't just a form of entertainment for your audience. It has to tie in with the bigger business as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, actually, I was just going to touch on that. But just from taking one step back, so leave the podcast in its kind of pure content form, surround it with your calls to action, your branding,
for sure,
without encroaching on the actual content itself.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. One of our shows with American Express is called Business Class Build It Braver. It's a show. It happens to be just for a Canadian audience, but it's just for Canadian small business owners. We mostly actually work within the United States, but in this case, it was a Canadian audience. Now, halfway through the show, the host comes on and says, something like, "Hey, if you're seeing a lot of value in this show and you want to learn more about being a small business owner, you can go to this URL, and we've got all sorts of amazing resources, tips, tricks, things to help you run your business. Go to this URL. We can track that URL, but also it's helpful, right? It's not a shameful plug. It's more about adding additional value to you as a business owner, but also you as a podcast listener.
Right. And within the context of the show, right? Sounds like
Exactly.
you're flowing kind of naturally over to that and making it optional.
Yeah, I mean, we just we just launched a show with Amazon called "This Is Small Business," and in one of the episodes we interview Vern Harnish, who's the author of Scaling Up, and he runs an incredible entrepreneurs organization, EO. For many of you that are probably familiar with that organization, now he has books. He's written a book, and at some point there is a reference to, hey, you can actually pick up your book on Amazon. Now, to me, that doesn't seem like a real shameful plug. That seems like a real smart way of saying, hey, this author's amazing. You're going to want to read his book. We are Amazon and we sell that book. Let's kick you there. So it seems like a nice tie-in to the show.
Right. So it is about the nuance and thinking about the tie-ins and contextualizing. It's really fascinating. Sure. I do want to dig in a little bit to ROI, because ROI will vary based on whether you're Amex or Amazon. But one of the things that I find interesting, and this is going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but I remember hearing this story. This is a few years back when the New York Times, prior to them having this kind of massive digital presence, they're all sitting in a room trying to figure out why people aren't buying that Deadwood newspaper every single day. And I remember hearing this. It was on NPR talking about media, and the editor-in-chief and the group had a kind of aha moment, which was, why are we worried about the medium? We're journalists. Mm-hmm. We tell stories. We report on current events. Mm-hmm. Do we care if it's on paper or on a website or on a mobile device?
Right.
Yeah. And terrestrial radio evolved into, a couple of evolutions into podcasting, where kind of like YouTube did with video, mm-hmm. which is you are now empowered to go out and just create your own station, right? Yeah. And
it's great.
It unlocks a world of possibilities for brands and small business. Yeah,
you're empowered to create your own station, but also, for anybody who's come or understands sort of the radio world, there's a lot of rules and regulations that go with radio. And right now, the podcast space is still kind of the Wild West. Now, are there going to be rules and regulations that come? For sure. That's just a natural evolution of a medium in any case. Look what's going on right now with the conversation around social media and freedom of speech and things like that. So, but ask anybody who's in who has a podcast or is in the podcast space. There's very little rules. Do you want to have a 10-minute episode? Go for it. Do you want to have a 60-minute? You want to be 2.5 hours like Joe Rogan and do it daily? Go for it. There's very little barrier to entry, but also very little rules and sort of like recipes you need to follow, other than tell a great story, don't be boring, have some fairly decent audio quality. Even then, it's not the end of the world if things go wrong. Your audience understands, as long as you're respecting them and you maybe explain kind of what happened. And just be consistent. That's one of the biggest parts.
I was gonna say I'm gonna say it here, but I've got a book in the works that I've had forever that I'm plugging away at. It's called Metronome Marketing, which is nice. Just like a metronome.
Love it.
Everybody wants to.
I can already visualize it.
Yeah. And it's the long-term stuff. The cool thing that you brought up about podcasts is a podcast is a very malleable thing. And it could be from Amazon. You've mentioned Amazon and Amex. I'll give you an interesting anecdote. Maybe we can dive in a little bit talking about niches and understanding your potential fan base, community, customer base as we go through. But we produced a podcast and a whole marketing strategy for a law firm out of Toronto. And they're intellectual property experts, right? That's what they do. They do IP, how you protect it. Their target was actually other lawyers and people that are pretty heavily into this. And there's a little voice in the back of your mind going, how many people are actually really interested in that? I'm not sure. Well, it turns out that there are a whole lot, many tens of thousands of people that are extremely interested in intellectual property law. And we live in a world of tribes and niches. I was actually
I'm smiling because
Yeah.
as we speak, we are literally producing a podcast on intellectual property. So sorry, keep going.
And they do it as they do it 12 times a year and tend to bulk it, and then it has this evergreen life to it. But the really fascinating thing to me, and that's why I've been fascinated with Reddit forever, is whatever you're interested in, right? If you want to grow earthworms in your backyard, there is a subreddit community for
the riches are in the niches.
Yeah, totally. So I guess the question I have is, like you said, you mentioned Amex, you mentioned Amazon. Those are big, giant brands that can cover a whole range of things. But if you're a smaller business and considering this, what's your process for identifying your niche and from a podcasting perspective? How do you approach that and kind of figure out what that sweet spot is?
Yeah. So the first thing is, and actually I'll tie this into something you had mentioned a little while back about sort of building community and understanding who your community is as a business is always important. Whether you're a small business or a nonprofit or, anything that has stakeholders really that have a connection to the company. So really being clear on who that is. But then one of the things that we'll do is go out to that community and ask them, like, hey, we're thinking about starting a podcast. What would you want to learn? What would you want to have us talk about? Like, what do you think about the world, today, or maybe drip in a few topics that perhaps you're thinking about to get their perspective on it. Like, have them help you build the podcast. Just really be clear on like, what does that audience need? And then how can we deliver that in the form of a podcast? Now, again, there's no rules really when it comes to format, for example, but there are some like tried and true types of formats. There's what we're doing right now, which is kind of a one-on-one sort of opportunity. There's like a talking head where it might just be you, Dan, and you're providing value to the listener on your own. There's the panel opportunity where maybe there's like 3 or 4 of us and you're the host and you're kind of trying to get different perspectives on an idea, or maybe it's a blend of those. Like maybe, one episode you do on your own and then you've got a guest the next, and then you do a panel once or twice a year sort of thing. And then there's all sorts of like, narrative style, documentary style, like you can get as complex as you want from there. But the biggest thing always comes down to, just like any other form of content marketing, like who's our audience, what do they need, and how can we deliver that to them in an engaging format.
Yeah. And I love the simplicity of just go talk to your customers in your community and just ask them.
Yeah. And you talked about like, evergreen content. Like if you're a small business and you're getting a lot of the same questions on a topic, or you're having, a lot of inquiries about a certain, issue or topic, create the podcast around answering those questions and just leave it at that. Like just make it as like simple as that. And, we're so used to thinking about podcasts in the manner of like, serialized, like Netflix, where if you miss one episode, you're going to be lost in the storyline. Like it doesn't have to be that way. It can very much be like walking into a library and picking the resources off the shelves that you need, but also understand that your audience might not listen to every single episode, and that's okay, because it might not contain information that they need. We did a podcast for Expedia called Out Travel the System, which was all about, they came to us with a brand challenge, which was that, we are the world's largest online travel platform. But when we look at the data, our customers don't always see us as helpful. They see us as like a tool. That side of it is great. But like, as a brand, we're not really adding like additional helpful layers. And we want to know if a podcast can help with that. And so that's what the show is called out. The show is called Out Travel the System. And it's all based on sort of providing tips and tricks on how to get the most out of your travels. So if you're a small family, you want to know how to go to Disneyland for under $2,000, which is very difficult. We've got an episode for you there. Or if you want to go to Paris for the first time and you've only got 36 hours, let's let's teach you about the best way to explore Paris. Or if you want to learn about how to visit all the, US national parks, we've got an episode on that. But we know that there's a good chance you're not necessarily going to listen to every single episode, because I might not have a family and have any interest in going to Disneyland. So I'm not going to listen to that episode, but I am interested in going to Paris with my, with my wife, and we don't have kids. So like, you have to kind of understand and set yourself up for expectation wise on sort of how much of the content your audience is going to listen to, and just be realistic around that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really important point that you make, because I think across all levels of digital, vanity metrics are something to really fight against. And in fact, the social media platforms, I think, are trying to very slowly get people away from, the number of likes, the number of followers. Quite often when we work with small to medium-sized businesses, have a geographic location, which is like 80% of all businesses in the world. The question is if you're in the Greater Toronto area and you've got an addressable audience of, say, 2 million people across that, would it make sense if you had 10 million followers? Maybe. I mean, if you're a celebrity, sure. But if you're a business, kind of thinking about your ideal niche, just as an example, Live at the Hive, we've been around for like 4 or 5 years. But we just basically started it on the assumption of like, let's just do this thing and we'll figure it out as we go.
Dude, that's how we started as well. And I literally put a message out on LinkedIn to 8 people, direct message saying, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. Is this of any interest to you? Yeah. The second person that responded said, it's not of interest to me, but it is to my wife, who's the head of digital at Sage Natural Wellness, which is one of the world's largest aromatherapy brands, retail location. It's an incredible company. Yep. She said, can you be in our office on Thursday? We said, yes, not knowing really what we were launching or doing. Didn't have pricing, didn't have a website, didn't even have a name. Jar Audio is actually Jen, Aaron, and Roger. That's actually where the jar comes in. And as an advertising and marketing guy, that I find that still to this day to be a bit lame, but it's literally what we threw together because we were just running as fast as we could because we all of a sudden had interest. And so it's stuck. And now I do actually love it, but it's, just get out there and start.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that we find, obviously digital marketing and business, and to your point, we do roundtables, we do panels, we do one-on-ones like we're doing, especially with people that are extremely experienced in a space like yourself. But we never serialize in the sense like, hey, you missed episode 219, you can't watch 220. The vast majority of anybody that consumes our content has actually searched for it, found a particular topic, whether it's, Facebook ads or, how do I build a community? And we've had lots of feedback, but it's quite often asynchronous. This is not the live version that's coming out this way. And I think that's something that businesses really should consider is this has really long-term value to you as you're building up this community and eventually, hopefully, your sales pipeline, right?
And I'll add, because I'm the same way. I'll use different podcast directories or search engines to find a specific topic because that's how I like to learn now. Is scaling your business. Like I want to hear an interview with somebody specifically about scaling their business. But that evergreen content conversation can be scary to some business owners because they're worried about the content getting stale. It's old, it's out of date, yada, yada, yada. But there's no better medium, maybe than like a blog post or something, than a podcast to update some of that older information, because a lot of times it can be, it's an audio file. You can literally go back and edit it, reinsert it. Some of the technology these days blends the volumes together quite well, and so you'll never know if you're listening that it's different. Or in the case of some of our clients, we know going in that some of this content is going to get stale, so we'll actually put a bit of a donut in the episode, and then we'll dynamically insert content into the episodes. One of our, again, with Expedia, some of the information that it was provided was very specific to travel and COVID. And as we know, that was changing literally by the day. And so we actually purposely left a donut in the episode where we could insert the latest information dynamically. And that got injected into a few episodes. And so you can go back and edit quite easily, which you can't always say the same thing about video, because you got to get the lighting right. You got to get the location again. If you want to edit something, it's just a little bit more cumbersome than audio.
Yeah, for sure. And you can't, I mean, if you've got your video on YouTube or Vimeo and you replace it, you wipe out the stats, you wipe out the history of it, you wipe out all sorts of things. So yeah, totally agreed. Just to circle back on ROI, I think something like Amazon is fairly straightforward. You want to buy the book. Amex, relatively simple. Ultimately, get your card. For B2B businesses that maybe have a longer sales cycle, law firms are a great example. You're not going to book an appointment, or you might want to be wary if someone's going to book an appointment immediately there. In terms of ROI, how do you rationalize seeing that return on investment for a business that maybe doesn't have like this obvious conversion point with a dollar amount attached to it?
Yeah, I'll be honest, it's challenging. Again, it's going to vary depending on the business and depending on the category and all those sorts of things. But a lot of it comes down to everything from the amount of engagement and the amount of audience and the engagement length of that audience. So we can tell how long people are listening for. We can tell how many of them there are, but then we can get down into the specifics of where they are and even some demographic and psychographic information now. So it really depends on the brand and what's important to them. But if you're a law firm, for example, and you want to know whether the podcast is directly tied to specific leads, I mean, we can tell whether somebody's listened to the podcast and ended up on your website. We can tell whether they've then clicked on a form to, learn more about you or reach out to you. The technology side can really, the technology side can do pretty much whatever we want to when it comes to that, tracking that. But again, we've had clients say that the ROI is really in some of the feedback that they get from their audience on the show, that they are listening. Nonprofit organizations have reported that the show is being brought up in sort of donor conversations. I've either first learned about you or I learned more about you through the podcast. So again, it totally depends.
Yeah, and I think measuring. Sorry for those of you watching on video. My MacBook has a faulty power cable, and that's why I've got the that's behind me here. You pay about 100% more for a MacBook, and they can't make a decent cable. I'm not going to rant about Apple right now. I'm a long-time Apple user.
Things have gotten worse and worse every year.
Well, since Steve Jobs had a runway of I think 3 or 4 years, and it's kind of been going dead. Yep. Like that. I could talk for hours about Apple, my sagas with them over the years. But I think the interesting thing in terms of measuring ROI, the interesting thing is I think brands are starting to get into the mindset that like ROI can be calculated to a certain degree, but there's also this qualitative feedback from your customers, like you're saying, whether it's, surveying people that are listeners and making a call out, having them participate in show topics, et cetera. I think there's the value there where podcasting to me is it should be top of funnel. It's awareness, it's interest, it's explaining your skill set, educating and entertaining, as opposed to necessarily, like to your point, who wants to watch a 30-minute commercial. Like, I don't watch infomercials regularly.
For
Sometimes
sure.
I get sucked in.
But you can also use the platform to help further down in the funnel if you want, because it can help educate on a certain topic or idea. Again, that would be more in line with an ad, but if you set up the context right, and it is meant as a sort of a portable audio way of learning more about XYZ product, perhaps you're B2B and you've got a real technical product, and it makes sense to provide, you know, your listeners with a little bit more information about it, or perhaps you're in a specific industry that, you know, you want investors to learn more about, or you want your eventual purchaser to learn more about. It's a great medium for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to kind of circle back on that in terms of the medium and how you know, niche down. I had started these series of what was called the Internet Marketing Minute, but it was basically, I had friends that had seen some of my YouTube videos, this is years ago, and colleagues, and say, yeah, that was really good. It was just a bit long, right? I'm like, I'm on the subway, or I'm on the bus, or I'm in my car. I have a 12-minute, 13-minute drive. And it's perfect for that. And yeah, there's marketing school, whatever you think of about Neil Patel in terms of him being a marketer. He's really a very effective
he's great.
Yeah. But they have, you know, between 7 and 8 minute podcasts that they put out, nice and snackable, super quick, one topic. So it's closer kind of to the snackable content side. But there's also that to consider, and you mentioned that before, is like, of all of these formats, like you could go the Joe Rogan style of 4 hours or 3.5 hours long and dive deep, or you could go the marketing school side and anything in between.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things we do with our clients is we'll do sort of an audit of their other content and get a, you know, if they have a lot of video content, like how long are their videos? What's the list? You know, what's the watch length on those? Because then that'll tell us that the audience is perhaps a little bit more inclined to, you know, to stick around longer with them. We don't really have a rule for how long our shows will be. I mean, we have to think about it when we're pricing our shows, but typically they're about 20 to 30 minutes. But then all that data is going to show us whether that was the right call or not, and then we'll adjust from there. So if we're seeing, you know, a consistent drop off at maybe the 20-minute mark, then maybe we shouldn't have gone with 30 minutes, and we can dial it back for future productions. Again, if you're going to go out to your community and ask them, hey, we're thinking about doing a podcast, you know, what should we talk about? What should it be about? I would also ask them, how long should it be? How long do you like to listen for? Because if you're, you know, if you're an executive and you don't have a ton of time, you're going to want something a bit snappy. That being said, executives also commute, and we've had some of our executive focused podcasts be 20 to 30, some are even 40 minutes long, because it's that perfect sort of drive time. It comes down to the audience, and make them part of the production, and you can have a lot of success in making some of those production decisions with them.
That's awesome. Just a couple more minutes, and as we wrap up here, one question that I have for you: if a business is considering podcasting, we're beyond contacting Jar Audio, and we'll give you the chance to kind of do the shout out and how they can contact you. But I would imagine that there are some businesses that just don't have the budget, right? So if they don't have the budget, what's your advice if there's an interest there? How would someone get started in the most basic steps possible?
So I would start with getting some equipment. Amazon has a lot of great equipment. You're honestly not going to spend much more than maybe $500 in, you know, for really good, decent microphone, some headphones. I wouldn't try anything with Bluetooth. I would hardwire your headphones direct, because Bluetooth has a tendency to disconnect sometimes in an interview. Anyways, I'm getting down the weeds, but yeah, I mean, and then choose a host provider. So these companies that act as the host for your audio file, and then also push it out to all the different directories. So everything from Megaphone to Simplecast and Omni, you know, these are all really great companies that are available out there. And just start. I mean, the best thing you can do is to just play around with it, have conversations, you know, interview your spouse, interview your mom or dad, like, you know, just start playing around with it. But I think the biggest thing is go in with a bit of an idea of what value you're providing to whoever it is that you want to have listen, and then just start playing around with answering that question. And and ask for feedback. Provide it to your audience and ask for feedback, and just keep going from there.
Yeah, one of the things I love that you touched on there is not being afraid to change and pivot and adjust. I think a lot of people have it in their minds. Maybe we were trained by television from our generation, where it's it's a 22-minute sitcom episode or whatever it is, 44 minutes for a drama. But that, hey, it's okay to reduce the length of it, to change the format, and you don't need to make a big announcement. You just need to be willing to make those changes midstream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think the relationship that a host has with its listener is incredibly special. And so they're going to see, or they should be able to see sort of, who you are and kind of warts and all. And so if you're going to try something out, mention it to them. Like, say, hey, you know what, I'm kind of playing around with the idea of doing this. And just be honest and open with them. Say, hey, I'm new to this podcast space, but I really want to create value for you, the listener. So I'm going to try this or this. If you have a day where your technology is not awesome and you still want to record because you have something amazing you want to say, just mention it. Say, hey, you know what, the audio is not the greatest in this episode. I'm really sorry. I'm going to do better. At the end of the day, they're looking for great storytellers. They're looking to be told a great story. They're looking to meet interesting people, learn, delve into certain topics. Sure, you want to have great audio quality because it is an audio medium. And like I mentioned, you are whispering into their ear. You might as well do it crystal clear.
Yep.
But things are going to happen, and they're okay with that. I've heard a lot of wild things from hosts, and I feel like I know them more than I know some of my best friends now. Because they're just open and honest and genuine.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important. Just as an example, a few minutes
your lights just went out, and you told us, and that's great. Like, I think that happens, right?
Yeah, and it's not the end of the world. It's not interrupting our audio. It's just, if you're watching, it looks like a dance club in here at moments. But yeah, it's I think there's also that authenticity, and I think communities, and look, fundamentally, people want to buy from people that they know and they like. It's an age-old kind of tradition.
For sure.
And, technology screws up all the time, right?
Yeah.
Just minutes before, I was having an audio issue. We just had to sort it. I've had lots of episodes over the years. You kind of laugh it off. You make a blooper reel at the end of the year. Everybody has fun with it. Yeah.
I just listened to one of my favorite podcasts. It's a comedian. And every once in a while he'll do an episode with his wife. They just admitted that they did an amazing episode together and forgot to press record. So the episode we were listening to was their second sort of shot at it, but that became part of the conversation, was this whole idea of, sort of mistakes and like, it was fascinating. It was great.
No, that is awesome. So we're a little bit over time, but that's all good.
No worries.
So Roger, tell everybody how they can get a hold of you if they're interested in looking at your podcasting production, and some of your work.
Yeah, so they can check out jaraudio.com. So JAR audio.com. I've got a fantastic blog on there. So, as a business owner, we focus on content about the podcast space, but specifically for brands. So make sure to check that out. And also within our site, we've got all of our show productions, our process, and a good little overview of who we are as a team. We operate globally. So if you happen to be interested in getting into the podcast space as a brand, we always love to start those conversations.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Roger, for joining us today. You've imparted just a ton of information about podcasting. I'm sure that you forget more about podcasting in one day than many people will ever learn in their lifetime. So we really appreciate having you on, and look forward to potentially having you on again in the future.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode of Live at the Hive, Digital Marketing from the Trenches. As I didn't open the show, but I'll close the show with it. If you're watching us on Twitch, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, or on Google Podcasts or Apple Podcasts, blah, blah, blah. Feel free to hit that like, hit that subscribe. If you're somewhere where you can comment, drop a comment if you've got a question. If we can't answer it, we will harass Roger via email, and hopefully he'll answer for you.
For sure.
But we're always here to help out. So thanks again, and we will see you next week on Live at the Hive. Same B time, same B channel. Peace.